So, former flyweight title contender Brandon Raw Dog Royval had some words to say about the qualifications for becoming a UFC title contender, for being able to fight for the UFC title in a title fight. Because apparently the UFC has some sort of requirement, and there's been rumors of this, for a potential UFC title contender to have a certain amount of followers on certain social media platforms before they actually can be considered to fight for the title. And, when I first heard this, because now I'm hearing it once again, but I've heard this before. And when I first heard this, I was appalled. I was appalled. I was a pretty much newly budding UFC fan. I had a lot of love for the sport, not much for the theatrics, but mostly for the sport. And once I heard that the UFC did, in fact, have some sort of requirement for up and coming or fighters who are becoming contenders to have a certain amount of followers, a certain amount of people that like them on social media, to actually be able to test their skills at the highest level possible in the UFC against the champion of a certain division. You have to have people like you on social media before you can do that, before you can test your skills at the highest level. You know how stupid that sounds? I mean, there are fighters that go out of their way to be the most unlikable fighter in the entire division, like Colby Covington or Josh Hogan. Sure, they try to be likable to a certain specific demographic of people, but the demographic is so small that they're going to end up, assumedly, they're going to most likely end up being unliked by the majority of UFC fans. If they're constantly catering to one specific group of people, you know, and like, how are those fighters able to get opportunities, without having a ton of followers? It doesn't make any sense. And I'm not sure, like, and this is the specific thing about the UFC's history that I feel disproves that, this whole follower count criteria should even exist. Steve Erceg and his chance to fight for the title against Alexandre Pantoja. What was that about? Steve Erceg was ranked, 8 or 10 in the flyweight division before getting the title shot against Pantoja? And I get it. I get why he was selected. The UFC was running out of contenders to fight Pantoja. Pantoja was getting rid of all his opponents. They had no one else to really get for him, before he ends up lapping the division. So they had to pull out Steve Erceg from the lower echelon of the list and pair him with Pantoja. But I'm definitely sure Steve Erceg didn't have some crazy number of followers. Nobody knew the guy. All they knew is he looked like Michael Scott. And then they ran with that, and that's why he's a name today. The same thing with the John Pork guy that's part of Islam's team or Khabib's team. These guys resemble memes or popular characters or figures in entertainment. So they kind of are able to build a name off of those coincidences. So Steve Erceg, this guy that wasn't very famous on any social media platform, not a well-known guy, not a big UFC name, pulled out from the lower half of the UFC flyweight rankings and paired with the most dominant flyweight we've seen since Demetrius Johnson. How does that happen? So I don't know why the UFC didn't allow Brandon Raw Dog Royval to get a title shot. I don't know specifically why they chose him to throw this qualification at. And this is my issue with the UFC in general. I really think that UFC rules apply sometimes, and then other times they don't. Take judging for example. How we have a lot of close fights or close decisions that go the other way, or fights that go one way that nobody was expecting because the fight looked so clearly in the other guy's favor. You get fights like those where you don't really specifically know what the judges are scoring the fights on. Some judges may like striking. Some judges may love knockouts. Some judges like ground control time. Some judges like takedowns. Like, it all just depends, really. And I get the difficulty of judging an MMA fight because MMA, and I was thinking about this earlier, the sport of MMA contains an ocean of possibilities, an ocean of methods, practices of different ways you can win a fight. You can knock a guy out through kicks, through punches. Flying knees are a thing. They got this new thing, not a new thing, but this weird thing that Justin Gaethje does, the Rolling Thunder, where he'll do a cartwheel and throw his legs up in hopes of one of his heels knocking out the opponent in front of him. There's a lot of crazy things you can do in the sport of MMA because it's such a fluid sport. You can you can adorn so many different combat practices within the sport. You know, so it's kind of hard to really pick and choose what move or what method is effective over the other. You know, in my mind or in my opinion, you got to really just go with things like dominance, you know, held positions. I think ground control time should be something heavily considered. I think significant strike percentage is another thing that should be heavily considered. But again, you know, an MMA fight can turn into such a weird match that it can become so incredibly hard to judge. That's why you can also do unanimous. You can also do draws. You know, you can also just what's it called? Have a not a no contest, but a draw basically. Have both fighters win in a sense, or maybe none of them win. You know, so there's so many possibilities with the sport of MMA, and I think that sort of variation with how you can win a fight kind of bleeds into how a fight is judged. But it's also weirdly bleeding into what the rules are outside of fighting itself, like rankings, like considering who is actually the number one contender in a division, things like that. You know, that's why I'm weary over certain things that are going on right now, like what I spoke about earlier between Sean O'Malley and Song Yadong and Merab Dvalishvili and Peter Yan. You know, we could see Sean O'Malley step over Merab Dvalishvili and get the next title shot against Peter Yan. And maybe behind the scenes, the truth about it is that Sean O'Malley has more star power than Merab right now, which I don't really fully agree with, but I could see being the case because O'Malley, you know, he does have more of a liking with mainstream MMA fans than Merab does, because Merab is more grappling heavy, and the mainstream MMA fans, they like striking. They don't like seeing grappling. They like seeing knockouts, and Sean O'Malley brings more knockouts, you know? Same thing with Dricus du Plessis in middleweight and what's going on between him and Sean Strickland and Khamzat Chimaev. We may see Dricus step over Khamzat Chimaev and fight Sean Strickland instead, because Dricus is on this bigger run and creating more exciting fights than a Khamzat Chimaev would with the blanketing and the constant grappling, you know? And yes, Khamzat does have some killer submissions. He's showcased them a couple of times in the UFC, but you know, against really high level fights, he's kind of, you know, only or mainly grappled, you know, like his fight against Dricus. So this is something weird that's going on now. It's something that we as the fans are really going to have to dissect and think about, which is what are the genuine, true rules, the concrete rules that pertain to the UFC, in all manners of the UFC, you know, in rankings, in considering who's a contender and who's not, in the actual cage, you know, things like that. You know, eye pokes are now a thing that's being looked at even more than they used to. You know, you used to let a guy eye poke his opponent 3, 4, 5 times in a match before taking a point. Now the first eye poke is, you know, usually now a point is immediately deducted from that because the commentators are commentating on it. The fans have seen fight after fight with it happening, and Cyril Gane versus Tom Aspinall was the straw that broke the camel's back, because it caused the UFC star to take so much time off to care for an eye injury that happened because of an eye poke. So now refs are judging, or are you know, they are what's the word? They are judging eye pokes more harshly. You know, they see an eye poke, it's like a out of bounds call in basketball. A point will be taken. No nonsense, no debate, no nothing. And I like that. I just want more of I want a better sense of what the rules are, and I hope you do too. Because a lot of these things are just confusing. This is all confusing. You know, what really what makes a UFC champion these days, you know? What's required for a UFC champion to be made? You know? Again, in all facets, what's required for that champion to win his title fight? What's required for that champion to get in a title fight in the first place? You know, so many different behind the scenes rules that should be questioned, not just simply looked over by the fans. Don't leave it up to the UFC. Don't leave it up to the big corporate bosses. You as the fan, we as the fans. The whole event is for us. We pay to watch it, so we obviously should have a say in what we're watching. Let me know what you think.